He was supposed to protect him. That was the oath. That was the badge. That was the quiet promise made behind closed doors when nobody was watching. And yet, on that rain-soaked night, with the streetlights flickering like dying witnesses, the man sworn to stand between danger and flesh did the unthinkable. He pulled the trigger. The sound cracked through the alley like a judge's gavel, final and unforgiving. Pigeons scattered from the fire escape above. A woman screamed somewhere 3 floors up, then slammed her window shut. And just like that, a life meant to be safeguarded by the law collapsed into the gutter water, blood mixing with oil and rain. The officer stood frozen, gun still raised, breath ragged. His partner whispered his name, but it was already too late. The body at his feet wasn't reaching anymore. The eyes were already going dull. This wasn't supposed to happen. By morning, the papers would call it a tragic misunderstanding. By noon, the precinct would close ranks, and by nightfall, the city would begin the familiar ritual of forgetting. But the streets didn't forget, and neither did the man who had warned them all this day would come. Because the man lying dead in that alley wasn't just another name. He wasn't a statistic. He wasn't a suspect who failed to comply. He was under protection, and the one who killed him was the very man assigned to keep him alive. That betrayal would ignite a reckoning that reached from the basements of tenement buildings to the polished floors of City Hall. A reckoning that would expose how cheap some lives were considered and how dangerous it was to make that calculation in a city that still believed in legends. Years before the gunshot, before the blood, before the lie became official truth, the man they would eventually silence had already made himself known. They called him Elias Crowe, not because he was cruel, not because he circled death, but because he watched. Elias Crowe was the kind of man who noticed everything. The way a patrol car slowed just a little too much on certain blocks, the way landlords suddenly raised rents after a random inspection, the way informants disappeared when their usefulness ran out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, carried himself with a quiet certainty that unsettled men who were used to being feared. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He remembered. In the late 1940s, the city was a machine grinding at full speed. Industry booming, veterans returning, neighborhoods changing hands through paperwork and force in equal measure. And in the middle of it all were men like Elias, men who lived in the seams of the system, close enough to see its gears, far enough to get crushed by them. He had been a dockworker once, a union man, a witness to things unions weren't supposed to see. When certain crates went missing, when certain names were paid to stay quiet, Elias was the man others trusted to speak plainly. That made him dangerous, but it also made him necessary. By the time the city took official interest in him, Elias had already outlived 2 investigations and 1 attempted framing. He knew which bars the detectives drank in. He knew which captains ran their precincts like private kingdoms. And he knew that truth, by itself, didn't protect anyone. So when the district attorney finally called him in, not as a suspect, but as a witness, it came with conditions. Protective custody, a uniformed detail, a promise. The officer assigned to him was named Thomas Hale. Clean record, war veteran, decorated, The kind of man the department liked to point to when questions got uncomfortable. He shook Elias's hand firmly the first day and looked him in the eye. "I'll make sure you get through this," Hale said. Elias studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He had learned not to trust words, only patterns. At first, everything went by the book. Safe houses, check-ins, quiet drives through back streets. But slowly small fractures appeared. Missed calls, unnecessary detours, conversations that stopped when Elias entered the room. And then came the pressure. Men Elias didn't recognize began showing up where he was supposed to be hidden. Old acquaintances warned him to keep his mouth shut. A folded note appeared under his door one morning with only 4 words written in block letters. "Last chance to walk away." Elias brought it to Hale. Hale barely looked at it. "Probably nothing," he said. "People like to scare themselves." That was when Elias knew the machine had already decided what he was worth. Still, he didn't run. Because Elias Crowe believed that if the truth was going to cost him his life, it was better spent standing than kneeling. He believed the city needed to see what happened when protection turned into execution. He just didn't know yet how literal that lesson would become. On the night everything ended, Hale insisted on moving Elias early, said there was chatter, said it wasn't safe to wait. The rain came down hard, blurring the streets, washing faces into shadows. They turned down an alley that wasn't on the route. Elias opened his mouth to question it, and that was when the gun came up. For a brief second their eyes met. Elias searched Hale's face for hesitation, for conflict, for anything human. He didn't find it. Only resolve. The trigger pull echoed louder than any testimony Elias would ever give. And in that moment, the city made its choice. What it didn't realize was that killing Elias Crowe wouldn't bury the truth. It would sharpen it. And the legend born from that betrayal would haunt the men who thought the badge made them untouchable. By dawn, the alley was clean, hosed down, scrubbed, sanitized of meaning. What remained was a chalk outline, already fading under the morning sun, and a single bullet casing catalogued, bagged, and quietly redirected into the evidence locker no one ever audited twice. The official report would later say Elias Crowe lunged. It would say Officer Thomas Hale feared for his life. It would say the shooting was regrettable but justified. The report would say many things. The streets said something else. Word traveled fast in the neighborhoods Elias had moved through for years. Dockworkers heard it first, then the union halls, then the corner stores where men pretended not to listen but memorized every detail. They knew Elias wasn't armed. They knew he'd been under protection. And they knew protection didn't end with a bullet in the chest unless someone higher up had signed off. If not on paper, then in silence. Within 48 hours, the district attorney withdrew all pending inquiries Elias had been cooperating on. Files disappeared. Witnesses were suddenly unreachable. A case that had been months in the making evaporated like steam off hot pavement. That was the real crime. And it didn't go unnoticed, because Elias Crowe hadn't been alone in this fight. He'd been part of a quiet network of men and women who believed the city didn't belong solely to those with badges or bankrolls. Among them was a man who had learned long ago how power actually worked. His name was Samuel Booker. Booker didn't hold office. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't raise his voice. But when he walked into a room, conversations adjusted themselves. He was a former organizer, a fixer, when fixing meant keeping blood off the streets rather than hiding it under paperwork. He and Elias had been close enough to argue, close enough to trust each other with inconvenient truths. When Booker heard how Elias died, he didn't curse. He sat down. Because men like Booker knew that when the system moved this fast to close ranks, it meant the threat Elias posed was very real and very much unfinished. Booker requested a meeting with Internal Affairs. They declined. He requested a meeting with the district attorney. They postponed. He requested a meeting with the precinct captain overseeing Hale's unit. That meeting happened. The captain was named Richard Malloy, a career man, polished shoes, office with a view. He listened patiently as Booker laid out the timeline, the inconsistencies, the broken protocols. When Booker finished, Malloy folded his hands. "Officer Hale followed procedure," Malloy said calmly. "This department stands by its men." Booker leaned forward just enough for his shadow to cross the captain's desk. "And who stands by the dead man you were supposed to protect?" Booker asked. Malloy's expression hardened.
"This conversation is over."
That was the moment Booker understood the challenge clearly. This wasn't about one bad officer. This was about authority protecting itself at all costs. And authority, when challenged publicly, responded with force. Within days, Booker began feeling the pressure Elias had warned him about. Permits delayed, phone lines tapped, anonymous tips suggesting Booker himself was under investigation. Old charges threatened to resurface. The message was unmistakable. Stop digging. Instead, Booker dug deeper. He found the patrol logs showing Hale's detour that night. He found a dispatcher willing to admit the call had been rerouted. He found a janitor at the courthouse who remembered seeing a file removed after hours. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Elias Crowe hadn't just been a witness, he'd been leverage. The men he was prepared to testify against weren't street-level operators. They were contractors, political donors, intermediaries between organized labor and organized crime. Elias had been the hinge holding several locked doors together. And Thomas Hale? Hale had been chosen because he was trusted and because he could be managed. Hale didn't disappear after the shooting. He wasn't reassigned to a desk. He wasn't put on leave. He was promoted quietly, shifted to a unit with less visibility, more insulation. That told Booker everything. So Booker changed tactics. If the law wouldn't confront itself, the city would have to watch the law be confronted. He leaked just enough information to a reporter who still believed in bylines over access. He arranged for Elias's funeral to be public, dignified, impossible to ignore. Dock workers marched. Union men stood shoulder to shoulder with ministers and veterans. No chants, no signs, just presence. Thomas Hale drove past the procession in an unmarked car. He didn't slow down, but he saw it. And for the first time since the trigger pull, something like doubt crept in. Because pressure didn't just come from the streets, it came from inside the department. Younger officers whispered about the case. Veterans who'd seen too much started asking quiet questions. Internal Affairs reopened the file, not officially but carefully. Captain Malloy felt it too. The tension, the attention, the risk. And risk made men like Malloy dangerous. He summoned Hale late one evening. "You did what you were supposed to do," Malloy told him, pouring 2 drinks. "But understand something. If this turns, it turns on you, not on me, not on the department." Hale nodded, jaw tight. "Then it won't turn," he said. That was the moment Hale crossed from obedience into ownership, and ownership demanded finality. The city stood at a precipice now. On one side, silence, promotions, the familiar comfort of unchallenged authority. On the other, exposure, accountability, and a reckoning that could tear careers and reputations apart. Elias Crowe had died, believing the truth was worth the cost. The question now was whether anyone left alive was willing to pay it. Because the next confrontation wouldn't happen in an alley. It would happen in full view. And when it did, there would be no report strong enough to contain it. By the time the city realized this story wasn't going away, it was already too late to control it. What began as whispers had hardened into questions. What started in union halls found its way into church basements, veterans' lodges, and eventually the newsroom desks where editors still remembered what journalism was supposed to look like. Elias Crowe's name stopped being spoken in past tense. It became a reference point, a line men drew in conversations that suddenly mattered. And at the center of it all stood Samuel Booker. Booker didn't grandstand. He didn't lead marches or shout at microphones. He worked the way Elias had, quietly, methodically, with an understanding that power hated being exposed more than it feared violence. Booker knew if he pushed too fast, the machine would crush him. If he moved too slow, the truth would be buried forever. So he applied pressure where it couldn't be ignored. He arranged private meetings between the reporter and dock workers willing to go on record. He provided copies of altered patrol logs, never originals, always enough to raise suspicion. He connected a retired judge to a priest who'd heard confessions that never made it into courtrooms. Each move was calculated. Each move made the situation more unstable. Captain Malloy felt the walls narrowing. His phone rang more often. City Hall wanted updates. The district attorney wanted assurances. And Internal Affairs, once obedient, started asking for written statements instead of verbal ones. Malloy responded the only way men like him knew how. He escalated. Surveillance cars appeared near Booker's apartment. Officers stopped him for routine questioning. A notice arrived claiming Booker's organization had tax discrepancies dating back years. And then came the warning. A man Booker didn't recognize approached him outside a diner one night. No uniform, no badge, just a quiet voice. "You're walking into something bigger than you," the man said. "Crowe made his choice. Don't make the same one." Booker didn't answer. He finished his coffee, stood up, and walked away. Because Booker understood something the system always underestimated. Fear worked best on men who believed they were alone. And Booker was not alone. Across the city, Elias Crowe's death had awakened something old. Not anger. Anger burned out too fast. This was resolve. A shared recognition that protection under the law had become conditional, and those conditions were written by men who never paid the price. The pressure reached Thomas Hale in quieter ways. At first, it was just looks. Officers who once laughed with him now kept conversations short. A sergeant he'd trained under avoided eye contact. Even his partner, the one who'd been there that night, requested a transfer. Hale told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he'd done what was necessary. But the silence followed him home. At night, he replayed the alley in his mind. The rain, the hesitation he pretended he hadn't felt. Elias's eyes, not pleading, not defiant, just aware. Hale drank more, slept less, and then the subpoena arrived. Not for him, for his partner. Internal Affairs wanted testimony, on record, under oath. That was when Hale went to see Captain Malloy again. "This is getting out of hand," Hale said, standing rigid in the office. "You said this wouldn't turn." Malloy didn't offer him a drink this time. "I said we'd handle it," Malloy replied. "Handling takes time." "I'm the one who pulled the trigger," Hale said. "If someone talks—" Malloy stood, walked to the window overlooking the city. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "You are protected as long as you are useful. Do not forget that." The words landed harder than any threat. Hale left the office, knowing something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. If this collapsed, he would be the sacrificial offering. And sacrifices didn't get to tell their side of the story. Meanwhile, Booker prepared for a move that would force the confrontation into daylight. He secured a closed-door meeting with a city council subcommittee, ostensibly about labor oversight. Elias Crowe's name wasn't on the agenda. Thomas Hale's wasn't either, but Booker made sure the right people were in the room. He spoke calmly. He presented documents. He asked questions that didn't accuse, but demanded answers. Why was a protected witness moved without authorization? Why were patrol logs altered after an officer-involved shooting? Why had no independent prosecutor been assigned? Silence followed each question. That silence was louder than any confession. Within a week, the subcommittee announced a public hearing on police conduct and witness protection failures. The city reacted immediately. Editorials split. Unions demanded accountability. Police leadership condemned political theater. And Thomas Hale's name, once buried in paperwork, began to surface in print. Not accusations, facts, dates, times, decisions. Hale saw his name in the paper one morning and felt something break loose inside his chest. Not guilt, fear, because fear understood what pride could not. This was no longer about Elias Crowe. This was about whether the badge could kill a man under its protection and expect the city to accept it. And that question was about to be asked in a room full of cameras, witnesses, and men who had spent their lives avoiding consequences. The confrontation was coming, not in an alley, not in shadows, but in a place where lies had to look truth in the eye and hold their ground. The hearing room was built for order, high ceilings, heavy wood, flags pressed and symmetrical. A place designed to project calm authority, even when that authority was on trial. By the time the doors opened, every seat was filled. Reporters lined the walls, cameras hummed low, like insects waiting for blood. Thomas Hale sat alone at the witness table. His uniform was immaculate, medals polished, hands folded just tightly enough to show strain. From a distance, he looked like exactly what the department wanted the public to see: a professional officer unfairly scrutinized for doing his job. But those who knew how to read men saw something else. They saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked every movement in the room, the controlled breathing of someone bracing for impact. Captain Richard Malloy sat behind him 2 rows back, calm, composed, a man used to weathering storms by waiting them out. He nodded once when Hale glanced back. That nod was supposed to mean reassurance. It felt like abandonment. Samuel Booker entered last. No escort, no papers in hand, just a dark suit and a posture that suggested he belonged exactly where he stood. He didn't look at Hale. He didn't look at Malloy. He looked at the council members, men and women who understood that what happened today would either restore faith or confirm every fear whispered in the streets.
The chairwoman called the hearing to order.
Formalities followed. Statements were read. The shooting was summarized in language carefully scrubbed of emotion. Then Thomas Hale was sworn in. "Officer Hale," the chairwoman said, "please describe the events of the night Elias Crowe was killed." Hale's voice was steady. He described the detour, the perceived threat. The moment he said, Elias reached suddenly. He used words he'd practiced, words approved by attorneys who understood plausible narratives better than truth. When he finished, there was a pause. Then Booker was invited to speak. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, he asked questions. "Officer Hale," Booker began, "were you aware that Mr. Crowe was classified as a high-risk, protected witness?" "Yes." "Were you aware that protocol required supervisory approval for any change in route?" "Yes." "And did you receive that approval?" Hale hesitated. "No." A murmur moved through the room. Booker nodded as if confirming something he already knew. "Why not?" "There wasn't time," Hale said. "I believe there was an immediate threat." Booker leaned forward slightly. "From whom?" Hale opened his mouth, then closed it. "I don't know," he said. "That's what made it dangerous." Booker turned to the council. "Madam Chair, may I submit the patrol log timestamp?" Showing Officer Hale radioed in the detour 7 minutes before the alleged threat occurred. The document was accepted. Hale's jaw tightened. Booker continued, "Officer Hale, are you aware that your radio transmission was rerouted through a private channel normally reserved for supervisory use?" No. "Are you aware that Captain Malloy authorized that reroute?" The room went still. Malloy shifted in his seat. Hale's head turned slowly, disbelief flickering across his face. "No," Hale said quietly. "I wasn't told that." That was the crack. Not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. Booker pressed on. "Officer Hale, did you ever express concern to your superiors about Mr. Crowe's safety prior to that night?" "Yes." "And what response did you receive?" Hale swallowed. "They told me to handle it." "Handle it how?" Another pause. Hale looked back at Malloy. Malloy didn't meet his eyes. "I was told," Hale said, voice tightening, "that the department needed this situation resolved." The chairwoman leaned forward. Resolved in what sense, officer? Hale's breathing quickened. In a way that didn't create complications. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Booker stepped back. He didn't need to say anything else. The damage was done. Captain Malloy was called next. He denied nothing directly. He reframed. He spoke of discretion, of chain of command, of difficult decisions made under pressure. He never admitted intent. But intent no longer mattered, because the pattern was clear. A protected witness had been isolated. Protocols had been bypassed. Oversight had been conveniently absent. And the officer who pulled the trigger had been left holding responsibility without authority. By the time the hearing recessed, the city already understood what had happened. Not because someone confessed, but because no one could convincingly deny it anymore. Outside, the crowd waited. When Booker stepped onto the courthouse steps, microphones surged toward him. "Was Elias Crowe executed?" someone shouted. Booker paused. "He was failed," Booker said, "by men who believed the badge protected them from accountability." Thomas Hale exited through a side door. He didn't speak to reporters. He went home and sat in the dark. That night, he received a call. It wasn't from Malloy, it was from Internal Affairs. They wanted a full statement. No protections, no guarantees. Hale hung up and stared at his hands. He thought of Elias Crowe's eyes, and for the first time since the alley, he understood the full weight of what he'd done, and what had been done to him. The system had used him,
And now it was done.
Justice never arrives all at once. It comes in fragments. Memos quietly issued, doors closing that once stood open, phones that stopped ringing when they used to answer immediately. In the days following the hearing, the city didn't erupt. It recalibrated. And for men who lived by invisible protections, recalibration felt like collapse. Captain Richard Malloy took a leave of absence for health reasons. His office was sealed pending review. Files long considered dormant were reopened, not aggressively, but thoroughly. The kind of thoroughness that didn't need to announce itself to be feared. Thomas Hale was placed on administrative suspension. No uniform, no patrol car, no reassuring nods in the hallway. Just a letter and an escort to the door. For the first time since joining the force, Hale was alone. The department issued a statement expressing regret over Elias Crowe's death and pledged full cooperation with an independent inquiry. The words were careful, legal, designed to absorb pressure without accepting blame. But the city heard what wasn't said. No one called Elias a threat anymore. No one used the word justified, and that mattered. Samuel Booker watched the shift from a distance. He didn't celebrate. He'd learned long ago that accountability wasn't victory. It was maintenance. If you turned your back too soon, the old habits crept right back in. Still, something had changed. At Elias Crowe's old union hall, men spoke more openly. Dockworkers who'd once refused to testify agreed to sit down with investigators. A clerk from the DA's office came forward with copies of missing documents. A dispatcher admitted she'd been instructed to reroute calls without logging them. Each piece alone meant little. Together, they told the truth. The independent prosecutor announced charges. Not murder, but conspiracy, obstruction, abuse of authority. Captain Malloy was named publicly. His attorneys resigned within a week. His pension was frozen pending outcome. Thomas Hale was charged separately, manslaughter. When the news broke, Hale sat at his kitchen table and listened to the radio in silence. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He nodded once, as if something long overdue had finally arrived. He requested a meeting with Samuel Booker. Booker agreed. They met in a small office overlooking the river, the same docks Elias had once worked. Hale arrived in civilian clothes, shoulders slumped, stripped of the posture that had once defined him. "I need to say this," Hale said, before Booker could speak. "I didn't pull that trigger because I hated him." Booker studied him. "Then why did you?" Booker asked. Hale looked out the window. "Because I believed the uniform mattered more than the man," he said.
And because I was afraid of what would happen
"If I didn't do what they expected." Booker nodded slowly. "That fear," Booker said, "is how this happens again and again." Hale swallowed. "I'm going to testify," he said, "fully, about everything." Booker didn't thank him. "This isn't about redemption," Booker said. "It's about consequence." Hale accepted that. The trial was brief. The evidence was clear. Hale was convicted, not vilified, not made an example of beyond what the facts required. He was sentenced according to the law he once enforced. The city watched, and for once, it believed what it was seeing. In neighborhoods where trust had been broken for generations, something cautious emerged. Not hope, but possibility. That the badge could be questioned. That authority could be made to answer. Elias Crowe's name appeared again in print, not as a footnote, but as the man whose death exposed a machinery too accustomed to operating unseen. A plaque was placed near the docks. No speeches, no ceremony, just a name and a date. Samuel Booker stood there one evening as the sun set, listening to the water slap against the pilings. He thought of Elias, of the stubbornness, the patience, the refusal to disappear quietly. The city hadn't become just, but it had been reminded that injustice had witnesses, and sometimes that was enough to force change. History doesn't remember moments the way they happen. It remembers what survives them. Years later, when the city spoke Elias Crowe's name, it wasn't with outrage anymore. It was with recognition. His story had settled into the public memory not as a scandal, but as a turning point, a line in the city's long argument with itself about power, protection, and the price of truth. The independent inquiry led to reforms that looked modest on paper, but felt seismic on the street. Witness protection protocols were rewritten. Route changes required multiple sign-offs. Independent prosecutors became mandatory in officer-involved deaths involving protected civilians. None of it erased what happened, but it made repetition harder. Captain Richard Malloy never returned to public service. His trial dragged on, hollowed out by testimony that exposed a career built less on leadership than on containment. He wasn't remembered as a villain. He was remembered as something more dangerous. A man who believed the system's survival justified any compromise. Men like that rarely saw themselves as corrupt. Thomas Hale served his sentence quietly. No interviews, no appeals. He worked in the prison library and kept to himself. Guards said he read more than anyone they'd seen. When asked once about the shooting, he answered only, "I understand it now." That understanding came too late to matter to Elias Crowe, but it mattered to the city. Samuel Booker never sought office, never accepted credit. He returned to the work he'd always done, organizing, mediating, reminding people that power didn't vanish just because it was exposed. When young activists asked him how Elias Crowe should be remembered, Booker gave the same answer every time. As a man who refused to let the truth die quietly. That refusal became the legend, not because Elias was perfect, not because he was fearless, but because he stood in a moment designed to break him, and didn't bend. In the neighborhoods Elias once walked, older men told the story carefully. They didn't dramatize the alley, they didn't glorify the gun. They talked about the protection detail, the promises, the betrayal. And they talked about what happened next, about how authority blinked when it was forced to explain itself, about how silence lost its power when enough people refused to keep it. Young officers learned about the case in training, not as a warning against scrutiny, but as a reminder of responsibility. Some resented it, others absorbed it quietly, knowing the badge meant nothing if it couldn't protect the vulnerable. That was Elias Crowe's legacy. Not vengeance, accountability. The city didn't become safer overnight. Trust didn't magically repair itself. But something intangible shifted. A shared understanding that protection wasn't just a word printed on a badge. It was a promise. And breaking it carried consequences. This story was never just about a gunshot in a dark alley. It was about a promise made by authority to protect those who dared to tell the truth, and how easily that promise was discarded when truth became inconvenient. Elias Crowe didn't die because he was reckless. He died because he believed the system would honor its word. And in that belief, he exposed what the system truly valued. But history has a way of correcting the record, because Elias Crowe's death did not silence the truth. It sharpened it. It forced men in power to speak carefully, to explain themselves, to confront the quiet arrangements they thought no one noticed. It reminded a city accustomed to compromise that protection without accountability is just another lie. The legend of Elias Crowe isn't built on violence or revenge, it's built on refusal. Refusal to disappear quietly, refusal to accept that some lives are expendable in service of order. Refusal to let authority define justice on its own terms. And in that refusal, something rare happened. The badge was questioned. The system was forced to answer. And the city remembered that power only survives unchallenged when people look away. Elias Crowe didn't live to see the consequences of his stand, but the consequences lived on because of him. In rewritten rules, in cautious reforms, in a generation taught that protection is meaningless if it ends in betrayal. This wasn't just about one man's death, this was about a community's dignity. And sometimes it takes a legend, not to conquer a city, but to remind it what justice is supposed to look like when the lights are on and everyone is watching.